Dr. Kai Nakamura had attended precisely 17 diplomatic sessions in the past month, and each one had been about as productive as trying to teach quantum physics to a particularly stubborn asteroid. The Sci-Fi delegation would arrive precisely on time, sit with perfect posture in their flowing robes, exchange pleasantries that revealed absolutely nothing, and depart with the same polite distance they'd maintained since first contact. "They're like beautiful, enigmatic statues," he muttered to himself, wandering through the terraced gardens that surrounded New Geneva Colony. Perfectly sculpted, completely impenetrable statues who probably think humans are about as sophisticated as caffeinated primates. The triple moons of Redania Prime cast everything in an ethereal silver light that made the alien flora seem to glow from within. Kai had been on the planet for 6 months, officially serving as the colony's chief cultural anthropologist, but privately feeling more like a professional failure. His job was to build bridges between species, to find common ground that could lead to meaningful cooperation. Instead, he'd managed to achieve what could generously be described as cordial mutual bewilderment. The path wound through carefully cultivated groves where earth plants grew alongside indigenous species in arrangements that somehow felt more like art installations than gardens. The Sci-Fi had insisted on helping design the colony's landscaping, and their aesthetic sense was undeniably sophisticated. Every plant, every stone, every flowing water feature seemed placed with mathematical precision that created an almost musical harmony. Kai paused beside a fountain where bioluminescent flowers floated on the surface, their gentle pulse synchronized with some rhythm he couldn't identify. "Maybe that's the problem," he said to the flowers. "We're trying to communicate with a species that thinks in symphony while we're still learning to carry a tune." An interesting metaphor. The voice came from directly behind him, melodic and warm, with an accent that turned standard Galactic into something resembling poetry. Kai spun around so quickly he nearly lost his balance, his heart launching itself toward orbit. She stood perhaps 10 meters away, having approached with silence that would have impressed a professional assassin. Her appearance immediately marked her as Sci-Fi, the elegantly pointed ears, the willowy height, the luminous skin that seemed to emit its own soft radiance in the moonlight. But there was something different about her, something that set her apart from the formal delegates Kai had been frustratingly failing to connect with. Her hair fell in an intricate braid that reached nearly to her waist, woven through with crystalline ornaments that caught and refracted the moonlight into tiny rainbows. Her robes were more elaborate than the simple garments worn by other Sci-Fi he'd encountered, with flowing fabric that seemed to shift color as she moved. Most strikingly, her bearing suggested someone accustomed to command, to being noticed and obeyed. "I didn't hear you approach," Kai said, trying to recover some semblance of professional composure. "I was just thinking out loud." Sci-Fi hearing is somewhat more acute than human auditory capabilities, she replied, moving closer with a grace that made walking look like a form of dance. "We often hear thoughts that humans believe they're keeping private." Kai felt heat creep up his neck. "How much of my conversation with the flowers did you hear?" "Enough to understand your frustration with our formal protocols," she said, and was that amusement in her voice. "Also your metaphor about symphonies and carrying tunes. It's more accurate than you might realize." She moved to stand beside him at the fountain, close enough that Kai could see the intricate patterns embroidered into her robes and catch the subtle scent of something like starlight in growing things. Her proximity revealed details about Sci-Fi physiology that his textbooks had failed to mention, the way her skin seemed to pulse gently with inner light, how her breathing created barely audible harmonic overtones, and the mesmerizing fluidity of her movements that suggested a deeper connection to the planet's rhythms. "I'm Dr. Kai Nakamura," he said, extending his hand in the traditional human greeting gesture. "Cultural anthropologist, professional diplomatic failure, and apparently terrible at private conversations." She looked at his outstretched hand with what might have been curiosity before reaching out to touch his fingers briefly. The contact sent a strange tingling sensation up his arm, like touching a live circuit that carried music instead of electricity. "I am Lyralii," she said, and something in her tone suggested the name carried significance he didn't yet understand. "It's an honor to meet you," Kai said, meaning it more than any diplomatic nicety he'd uttered in months. "Though I have to ask, are you supposed to be talking to humans informally?" Because I get the impression your people prefer their interactions with us to be somewhat more structured. Lyraliai's lips curved in what was definitely amusement. My people prefer many things, Dr. Nakamura. But occasionally, individual curiosity overrides cultural preferences. Curiosity about what? About humans who speak to flowers, she said. About species that express frustration through metaphor. About beings who continue trying to build connections despite repeated failure. Kai found himself studying her face, trying to read expressions that followed patterns he didn't recognize. You've been watching us. The colony, I mean. Observing, Lyraliai corrected. Learning. Trying to understand what makes humans so persistent. Stupidity, mostly, Kai said without thinking, then immediately regretted the flippancy. I mean, we tend to keep trying things even when logic suggests we should give up. Is that stupidity? Lyraliai asked, tilting her head in a way that made her crystalline ornaments chime softly. Or is it something else? Before Kai could formulate an answer, he became aware that other figures were moving through the gardens, Sci-Fi figures, searching with the systematic efficiency of people looking for someone specific. They're looking for you, he said, understanding flooding through him. Yes, Lyraliai confirmed, her expression becoming more formal. I should return. She began to move away, then paused, looking back at him with an intensity that made his breath catch. Dr. Nakamura, she said softly, what did you mean when you said we were like beautiful, enigmatic statues? Kai felt his face flame with embarrassment. She'd heard that part too. I meant that your people are incredibly beautiful, but we can't seem to connect with you. Like admiring a work of art that you're not allowed to touch. And if you could touch, she asked quietly. I think, Kai said carefully, I think we might discover that statues and people have more in common than either realizes. Lyraliai smiled then, a real smile that transformed her entire face and sent Kai's heart into an entirely new trajectory. Perhaps, she said, touching is simply a matter of finding the right approach. She turned and glided away into the moonlit gardens, leaving Kai standing beside the fountain with the distinct impression that his life had just taken a turn towards something far more complicated and infinitely more interesting than diplomatic protocol had ever suggested was possible. Kai spent the next 3 days in a state that could charitably be described as academically distracted, and more accurately as completely unable to focus on anything except a pair of violet eyes and the sound of crystalline ornaments chiming in moonlight. His research notes from the period would later prove nearly illegible, filled with absent-minded sketches of intricate braids and margin comments about harmonic breathing patterns. Dr. Nakamura, his research assistant Chen said during their morning briefing, you've been staring at the same data pad for 20 minutes. Either you've discovered something revolutionary about Sci-Fi agricultural techniques, or you're having what my grandmother would call romantic complications. It's not romantic, Kai protested automatically. It's anthropological curiosity about cross-species communication patterns. Aha, Chen said with the skepticism of someone who'd worked with academics long enough to recognize professional rationalization. Is this anthropological curiosity why you've been taking evening walks through the gardens every night this week? Kai decided that dignifying that observation with a response would only encourage further commentary. Instead, he threw himself into researching Sci-Fi cultural hierarchies, hoping to understand why Lyraliai's name had carried such weight and why her absence had triggered what appeared to be an organized search. What he discovered made him sit back in his chair and whistle softly. Chen, he called out, what do you know about the Moonweaver caste? Moonweavers? Chen looked up from his own research. They're mentioned in the preliminary cultural briefings, but only in footnotes. Some kind of specialized group responsible for ecosystem management. Why? Kai pulled up the relevant files, scanning through fragmentary reports and diplomatic observations. The picture that emerged was frustratingly incomplete but undeniably significant. Moonweavers appeared to be individuals chosen for their ability to interface directly with Verdania's biosphere, maintaining the delicate balance that kept the planet's complex ecosystem functioning. They were simultaneously scientists, artists, and something approaching what humans might call mystics. According to this, Kai said, Moonweavers are selected based on their capacity for what the reports translate as life harmony resonance. They can apparently communicate directly with the planet's biological networks. That sounds like science fiction, Chen observed. So did faster-than-light travel until we figured out how to do it, Kai pointed out. The Silithai clearly have biotechnology that's generations ahead of anything humans have developed. If they've learned to interface with biological systems at a quantum level. His speculation was interrupted by a soft chiming sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Both men looked around in confusion until they realized the sound was coming from outside, from the gardens where Kai had been taking his evening walks. That's not part of the colony's sound systems, Chen said, checking his instruments. Kai was already moving toward the exit. No, it's not. The chiming grew stronger as he approached the gardens, resolving into a complex melody that seemed to resonate in his bones. Other colonists had emerged from their quarters, looking around in wonder at the ethereal music that filled the night air. He found her waiting beside the same fountain where they'd first spoken, though tonight she wasn't alone. 3 other Silithai stood nearby, their postures suggesting they were attendants or perhaps guards. All wore the formal robes Kai recognized from diplomatic meetings, but Lyraliai's garments were even more elaborate than before, flowing fabric that seemed to capture and hold starlight, with crystal ornaments that pulsed in harmony with the mysterious music. Dr. Nakamura, she said as he approached, her voice carrying clearly despite the melodic backdrop. I hope you don't mind the intrusion. Not at all, Kai said, suddenly aware that his casual evening clothes were probably inadequate for whatever this occasion represented. Though I have to admit, I'm not sure what the appropriate protocol is here. There is no protocol, Lyraliai said, and he caught something like relief in her voice. This is informal. One of her attendants spoke rapidly in the Silithai language, too quickly for Kai's limited vocabulary to follow. Lyraliai responded with what sounded like polite but firm disagreement. They're concerned about propriety, she explained to Kai. Moonweavers are expected to maintain certain standards of dignity. And talking to humans violates those standards? Kai asked. Talking to humans alone, at night, without proper ceremonial preparation, Lyraliai clarified. Though I've pointed out that human customs don't require elaborate ritual for simple conversation. The music around them shifted, becoming softer and more complex. Kai realized that the sound was coming from the gardens themselves, the plants and trees responding to some stimulus he couldn't identify. The music, he said wonderingly, it's the ecosystem, isn't it? The planet is singing. Lyraliai's expression brightened with something that looked like pleased surprise. You can hear it as music. Most humans perceive it only as ambient sound, if they notice it at all. It's beautiful, Kai said honestly. Like a symphony performed by the entire biosphere. That's exactly what it is, Lyraliai said, moving closer to him. Her attendants remained at a respectful distance, but their body language suggested continued disapproval. Verdania Prime is a living network, Dr. Nakamura. Every plant, every microorganism, every geological formation is connected through quantum biological resonance. What you're hearing is the planet's consciousness expressing itself. Kai felt his academic mind struggling to process this information alongside his personal fascination with the woman explaining it. You can communicate with it. With the planetary consciousness. Moonweavers are trained from childhood to interface with the network, Lyraliai confirmed. We serve as translators, perhaps. Interpreters between individual awareness and collective consciousness. She extended her hand toward a nearby flowering vine, and immediately the plant began to glow more brightly, its bioluminescence pulsing in rhythm with her heartbeat. The music around them shifted in response, becoming warmer and more welcoming. That's incredible, Kai breathed. You're not just living on the planet, you're part of it. Yes, Lyraliai said softly. Which is why your people's presence here is so complicated. The weight of implication in her words sobered Kai's wonder. We're disrupting it, aren't we? The network. Human technology, human biology, we're introducing elements that don't belong to the system. Not don't belong, Lyralii corrected carefully. But yes, your presence creates dissonance. The network doesn't know how to interpret human consciousness patterns. We've been trying to understand whether integration is possible, or whether. She didn't finish the sentence, but Kai understood. Whether humans would ultimately prove incompatible with Verdania's living system and need to be removed. Is that why you've been watching us? He asked. To determine if we're a threat. Initially, Lyralii admitted. But I've discovered something unexpected. Which is? She stepped closer, close enough that he could see the complex patterns of light that played beneath her skin, synchronized with the planet's musical pulse. Human emotional resonance, she said quietly. When you spoke in the gardens that first night, when you expressed genuine feeling rather than diplomatic formality, the network responded. It recognized authenticity, even from a species it doesn't understand. Kai's heart began beating faster, though whether from her proximity or the implications of her words, he couldn't say. You're saying the planet can sense sincerity? I'm saying, Lyralii said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, that when you called us beautiful, you meant it. And that kind of authentic emotion creates harmony even across species barriers. The music around them swelled, as if the entire garden was listening to their conversation and approving of what it heard. Kai found himself leaning closer to her, drawn by forces he didn't entirely understand. Lyralii, he said softly, what are you really asking me? Her attendants spoke sharply in their own language, clearly indicating that the conversation had gone on long enough. Lyralii sighed, the sound carrying harmonics that resonated with the garden's song. I'm asking, she said, stepping back reluctantly, whether you would be willing to learn. About us, about Verdania, about possibilities that exist beyond the formal protocols our peoples have established. Yes, Kai said without hesitation. Whatever it takes. Lyralii smiled, and the entire garden seemed to brighten in response. Tomorrow night, then. Meet me here when the moons reach their zenith. And Dr. Nakamura? Yes. Bring your curiosity, but leave your recording devices. Some knowledge can only be shared, never documented. She turned to go, her attendants forming a protective circle around her as they moved back toward the Sci-Fi quarter of the colony. But just before they disappeared into the moonlight, Lyralii looked back at him one more time. Thank you, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the musical garden, for seeing beauty instead of strangeness. As they vanished into the night, Kai stood alone beside the singing fountain, wondering what he'd just agreed to and why it felt like the most important decision he'd ever made. Kai spent the following day in a state that oscillated between intense academic preparation and mild panic about what he'd agreed to. He researched everything he could find about Moonweaver traditions, Sci-Fi customs regarding cross-species interaction, and the complex ecological relationships that govern Verdania Prime's biosphere. By evening, he'd filled 3 data pads with notes and had approximately 17 new questions for every answer he'd found. Dr. Nakamura, Chen observed as Kai performed his 4th equipment check of the day, you're acting like someone preparing for either a final exam or a first date. Neither of which typically requires quite this level of intensity. It's not a date, Kai said automatically, then paused. Is it? Can interspecies cultural exchange qualify as a date? Because that wasn't covered in my xenosociology training. I think, Chen said diplomatically, that depends on whether the cultural exchange involves holding hands and staring into each other's eyes. Kai decided not to mention the hand-touching or the way Lyralii's violet gaze had made his cardiovascular system forget how to function properly. Instead, he focused on checking and rechecking his personal translator, even though Lyralii spoke perfect standard and had specifically requested that he bring no recording devices. When the triple moons reached their zenith, casting the gardens in silver radiance that made everything look like a fairy tale illustration, Kai made his way to the fountain. This time, Lyralei was waiting for him alone, dressed in simpler robes that somehow made her appear more beautiful rather than less formal. "No attendance tonight?" Kai asked as he approached. "I may have." Emphasized the anthropological importance of unstructured cultural interaction, Lyralei said with a smile that suggested she'd been somewhat creative with the truth. They agreed that academic research sometimes requires flexibility in protocol. "Academic research," Kai repeated. "Is that what this is?" Lyralei tilted her head, studying him with an intensity that made him feel like she was reading his thoughts. "What would you like it to be?" The question hung between them like a bridge that could lead in multiple directions. Kai found himself thinking about diplomatic protocols, professional ethics, and the complex responsibilities of representing his species in first contact situations. Then he looked at Lyralei, really looked at her, noting the way moonlight caught in her crystalline ornaments and how her presence seemed to make the garden itself more alive, and decided that honesty might be more important than protocol. "I'd like it to be a chance to understand you," he said simply. "Not the Sci-Fi, not the Moonweaver caste, not the planetary consciousness. You." Lyralei's expression softened into something that looked like relief. "Then follow me. I want to show you something that no human has ever seen." She led him away from the formal garden paths, through gaps in what he'd assumed were decorative hedges but which turned out to be carefully concealed entrances. Within moments, they were walking through a landscape that bore no resemblance to anything he'd seen on Verdania Prime. The trees around them pulsed with gentle bioluminescence, their trunks wider than buildings and their canopy so high it disappeared into the starlit sky. Flowers the size of dinner plates opened as they passed, releasing fragrances that seemed to carry melodies within their chemical signatures. Streams of water flowed uphill in impossible spirals, their surfaces reflecting light that came from no visible source. "This is the Heart Garden," Lyralei said softly, her voice barely audible above the symphony of living music that surrounded them. "The original consciousness node where Verdania's awareness first awakened." Kai stopped walking, overwhelmed by the sheer impossibility of what he was seeing. "How long has this existed?" "The network achieved consciousness approximately 50,000 years ago," Lyralei replied, moving to touch one of the massive trees. Immediately, its bioluminescence brightened, and the music around them shifted into more complex harmonies. "My people have been its partners for the last 20,000. "Partners," Kai repeated, trying to process the implications. "Not inhabitants. Partners. We don't live on Verdania," Lyralei explained, her hand still resting against the tree's surface. "We live with it. The planet provides for our needs, and we help maintain the balance that keeps the consciousness stable and healthy." As if to demonstrate, she began moving through the garden with fluid grace, touching plants and stones in patterns that seemed random but clearly weren't. Each contact sparked responses in the surrounding ecosystem, flowers blooming, streams changing course, trees swaying despite the absence of wind. The music grew richer and more complex with each interaction. "You're conducting an orchestra," Kai said in wonder. "The entire biosphere is your instrument." "Not mine," Lyralei corrected, though she looked pleased by his understanding. "Ours. The network and the Moonweavers work together. I can influence the patterns, but only within harmonies that the consciousness approves." She moved to a clearing where a pool of water reflected the triple moons with impossible clarity. The surface showed not just their images but also patterns of light that seemed to exist in dimensions beyond the visible spectrum. "This is where Moonweavers come to commune directly with Verdania's awareness," she said, kneeling beside the pool. "It's also where we test whether new elements can be integrated into the network without causing dissonance." Kai joined her beside the water, studying the shifting patterns with growing understanding. "You're going to test my compatibility with the planetary consciousness." "If you're willing," Lyralei said quietly. "The formal diplomatic protocols exist because integration has never been successful with non-Sci-Fi species. But your emotional resonance the other night suggests you might be different. And if I'm not? If I create dissonance?" Lyralei's expression became serious. Then the network will reject you. Painfully. And the question of human colonization will likely be resolved in favor of relocation. Kai looked at the pool, then at Lyralii, then at the impossible garden that surrounded them. The scientific part of his mind catalogued a dozen observations that would revolutionize human understanding of biological consciousness. The anthropologist in him recognized an opportunity for cross-species communication that could reshape galactic civilization. But the part of him that was simply Kai, simply a man who'd whispered admiration for a beautiful woman in moonlit gardens, made the decision. What do I need to do? Lyralii's smile was radiant enough to power a small city. Touch the water. Let Verdania see who you really are, beneath all the cultural conditioning and professional roles. Just be yourself. Kai reached toward the pool's surface, his fingers hovering just above the strange water. And if being myself isn't enough? Then, Lyralii said, her own hand moving to cover his, at least we'll know we tried. Their fingers touched the water together, and immediately Kai's world exploded into sensation beyond anything human neurology was designed to process. He felt the pulse of every living thing on the planet, heard the thoughts of trees that had been growing for millennia, experienced the slow, vast consciousness of a world that thought in geological time and dreamed in evolutionary cycles. Through it all, he felt Lyralii's presence like an anchor, her consciousness helping to guide his awareness through the overwhelming symphony of planetary thought. And slowly, impossibly, he began to understand that Verdania was not just accepting his presence, it was welcoming him. How? He gasped as the communion finally stabilized. Humans, Lyralii said wonderingly, her own amazement evident in her voice, apparently possess a type of emotional authenticity that resonates perfectly with planetary consciousness. You don't try to control or dominate, you simply experience and appreciate. The pool's surface had changed, now reflecting not just their images but also streams of light that connected them both to the network's vast web of awareness. Kai could feel the planet's contentment, its curiosity about this new form of consciousness it had encountered. What does this mean? He asked. Lyralii turned to face him, her eyes bright with possibilities that had never existed before. It means that humans and Sci-Fi might be able to share Verdania after all. It means that two species working together could create harmonies that neither could achieve alone. She moved closer, close enough that he could see his own reflection in her violet eyes. And it means that what began as a whispered compliment in a moonlit garden might become something that changes both our worlds. The garden around them pulsed with approval, the planetary consciousness adding its voice to the moment in ways that made words unnecessary. Kai realized that he'd found something he hadn't even known he was looking for, not just understanding between species, but connection that transcended every boundary he'd thought insurmountable. Lyralii, he said softly, what happens now? Her answer was a smile that carried the warmth of starlight and the promise of infinite possibilities. Now we discover what it means when two worlds choose to dance together instead of existing apart. The revelation that humans could harmonize with Verdania's consciousness created what diplomats would later describe as an unprecedented paradigm shift in interspecies relations, and what Kai privately thought of as the most beautiful disaster in galactic history. The morning after his communion with the planetary network, he woke to find his research station surrounded by both excited human scientists and concerned Sci-Fi officials, all demanding explanations for energy readings that had apparently lit up sensors across 3 continents. Dr. Nakamura, Director Walsh said during the emergency briefing, please explain how you managed to trigger what our instruments describe as planet-wide consciousness resonance during what was supposed to be routine cultural observation. Kai looked around the crowded conference room, noting the mix of human confusion and Sci-Fi carefully controlled alarm. I touched some water, he said finally. You touched some water, Walsh repeated flatly. Special water, Kai clarified. In a sacred pool. While holding hands with a moonweaver. It's more complicated than it sounds. The Sci-Fi delegation began speaking rapidly among themselves in their musical language, their tones suggesting that Kai's explanation had not improved their opinion of the situation. One of them, an elderly female with silver patterns woven through her braid, addressed the room in formal standard. The human has participated in consciousness binding without preparation, without permission, and without understanding of the consequences, she announced. This represents a violation of protocols that have protected our world's balance for millennia. With respect, Kai said, standing despite Walsh's warning glare, the planetary consciousness invited the contact. I didn't force anything, Verdania chose to welcome human awareness into its network. Impossible, the Sci-Fi elder declared. Non-Sci-Fi consciousness is incompatible with planetary harmony. This has been proven through extensive testing. Then explain why I can still feel the network's presence, Kai said quietly. Why I can sense the emotional states of every Sci-Fi in this room, why I know that 3 of you are afraid and 2 are curious, why I can hear the planets singing even through the colony's shielding. The silence that followed was profound enough to serve as a practical demonstration of vacuum acoustics. Finally, Lyralii spoke from her position with the Sci-Fi delegation. Elder Mirren, she said respectfully, perhaps we should consider that our previous testing methods were flawed. Dr. Nakamura's resonance patterns suggest possibilities we haven't explored. Elder Mirren's expression could have frozen hydrogen. Moonweaver Lyralii, your unauthorized interaction with the human has created a diplomatic crisis. The human consciousness is now linked to our planetary awareness in ways that cannot be easily severed. Actually, Kai said, feeling the planet's consciousness stir with something that felt remarkably like amusement, I don't think the link can be severed. Verdania doesn't want it severed. Director Walsh rubbed his temples. Are you telling me that an entire planet has developed opinions about our diplomatic relations? I'm telling you that an entire planet has always had opinions, Kai corrected. We just never bothered to ask what they were. The tension in the room was thick enough to serve as building material when an aide burst through the doors, his face flushed with excitement and panic in equal measure. Director, he gasped, you need to see the morning agricultural reports. Every human-planted crop in the colony has grown 3 weeks' worth overnight. The yield projections they're impossible. Through his connection to the network, Kai felt Verdania's contentment at this development. The planet was demonstrating its approval of the new partnership in the most practical way possible. It's trying to show us that cooperation benefits everyone, he explained to the room. Human agriculture enhanced by planetary consciousness, Sci-Fi biotechnology improved by human innovation. We could achieve things together that neither species could manage alone. Elder Mirren looked like someone who discovered that fundamental mathematics had decided to become creative. This violates every principle of ecological balance we've spent millennia maintaining. Or, Lyralii said quietly, it represents an evolution of those principles. Dr. Nakamura's integration suggests that balance doesn't require isolation, it requires harmony. The debate continued for hours, with human and Sci-Fi officials arguing about protocols, precedents, and the potential consequences of unprecedented interspecies consciousness bonding. Through it all, Kai felt Verdania's awareness like a gentle presence in the back of his mind, patient and amused by the complications that seemed so urgent to the individuals involved. When the official sessions finally ended in exhausted stalemate, Kai found himself walking through the gardens again, drawn by the planet's musical call. Lyralii was waiting for him beside their fountain, though this time she looked tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion. They want to separate us, she said without preamble. Elder Mirren believes that severing your connection to the network is the only way to prevent destabilization. And what do you believe? Kai asked, settling beside her on the fountain's edge. I believe, Lyralii said, her hand finding his with the naturalness of tides following moons, that Verdania chose you for a reason. That your species' emotional authenticity might be exactly what our world needs to grow beyond the limitations we've imposed on ourselves. Through their shared connection to the planetary consciousness, Kai could feel her deeper fears, that the Sci-Fi leadership would choose isolation over integration, that the delicate balance they'd achieved over millennia might be lost, that the connection they discovered might be forbidden before it could fully develop. There might be a way, he said slowly, an idea forming from the intersection of human pragmatism and planetary wisdom. What if we could demonstrate that human-Sci-Fi cooperation actually strengthens the network instead of threatening it? How? Kai stood, pulling her with him toward the heart garden she'd shown him the night before. By solving a problem that neither species could handle alone. As they walked, he outlined what he'd learned from the agricultural reports and his own research into Verdania's ecosystem. The planet's expansion into space, the growth of orbital habitats and off-world settlements, had been limited by the difficulty of extending its consciousness beyond the planet's surface. Sci-Fi biotechnology could create the biological frameworks, but they lacked the technical infrastructure to maintain complex systems in vacuum. Human technology could provide the missing elements, Kai explained as they reached the sacred pool. Quantum communication networks, self-repairing systems, artificial gravity generators. Combined with Sci-Fi biological engineering and guided by planetary consciousness, we could create living space habitats that maintain connection to Verdania's awareness. Lyraliai's eyes widened as she understood the implications. A true partnership. Sci-Fi and humans working together to help Verdania grow beyond planetary boundaries. Exactly. And the first step would be creating a demonstration, a small orbital habitat that proves the concept works. They knelt beside the pool, its surface reflecting not just their images but also the complex data streams that flowed between their minds and the planetary network. Verdania's consciousness stirred with interest as it absorbed their proposal, considering possibilities that had never existed before. The planet's response came not in words but in images, visions of living ships that pulsed with bioluminescent beauty, orbital gardens where Sci-Fi and humans worked side by side, spaceborne communities that maintained spiritual connection to their homeworld while reaching toward distant stars. "It's beautiful," Lyraliai whispered, her consciousness intertwining with Kai's as they shared Verdania's dreams. "It's possible," Kai replied, understanding flooding through him as the planetary awareness shared detailed plans that combined the best of 3 different types of consciousness. "We could start construction within months." Through their link, he felt Lyraliai's hope blazing like a star, tempered by the practical challenges they'd face. "The Council of Elders will resist. They'll see this as dangerous innovation rather than natural evolution." "Then we don't ask permission," Kai said, surprising himself with his boldness. "We build a prototype, demonstrate that it works, and present them with proof instead of theory." Lyraliai turned to face him fully, her violet eyes reflecting the pool's impossible light. "You realize what you're proposing? Essentially defying both our governments to pursue an unauthorized terraforming project based on interspecies consciousness bonding." "When you put it like that," Kai said, grinning, "it sounds even more interesting." Her laugh was musical enough to make the garden symphony swell in harmony. "You know, when I first heard you whisper in the moonlight, I thought you were simply appreciating beauty. I had no idea you were capable of such magnificent recklessness. I had no idea I was capable of falling in love with an alien woman who could convince an entire planet to break its own rules," Kai replied, the words emerging before his careful academic mind could stop them. The silence that followed was filled with the planet's musical approval and the gentle sound of Lyraliai's indrawn breath. Through their shared connection, Kai felt her heart racing in harmony with his own. "Love?" she said softly. Apparently, Kai confirmed, wondering if it was possible to die of emotional vulnerability. "Is that culturally appropriate? Because I'm still not entirely clear on the protocols." Instead of answering with words, Lyraliai leaned closer and kissed him, her lips carrying the taste of starlight and the promise of infinite possibilities. Around them, the heart garden blazed with bioluminescent approval, and through the planetary network, Kai felt Verdania's deep contentment at this union between its chosen partners. When they finally separated, both breathless and slightly overwhelmed by the intensity of shared consciousness during intimate contact, Lyraliai smiled with the radiance of triple moons. "In Sci-Fi culture," she said, "love that resonates through planetary consciousness is considered the highest form of harmony." "And in human culture?" "In human culture," Kai replied, pulling her closer as the garden sang around them, "love that can literally move worlds is considered pretty much the best thing ever." They spent the rest of the night planning their impossible project, their consciousness intertwined with Verdania's vast awareness as they designed futures that had never existed before. By dawn, they had blueprints for a living space habitat, a detailed proposal for human Silithite technical cooperation, and a love that had been approved by an entire planet. As the triple moons set and Verdania's star rose over the gardens, Kai realized that his whispered moment of admiration had indeed changed everything. Not just for him and Lyralii, but for two species who had discovered that the most beautiful harmonies came from learning to sing together instead of in isolation. The future they were building would have challenges, would require courage from both their peoples, and would demand new forms of cooperation that had never been attempted. But as he watched Lyralii's face in the growing daylight, feeling the planet's consciousness humming with contentment in the background of his mind, Kai knew that some discoveries were worth any risk. After all, the best anthropological insights had always come from those brave enough to step outside established protocols and discover what was possible when different worlds chose to dance together instead of apart.